Imagine the most terrifying, ruthless biker gang in history.
Right.
Like a massive, heavily armed syndicate that sweeps across continents, just leaving a trail of shattered empires in its wake. But, and here's the twist, imagine that same biker gang is also somehow single-handedly responsible for keeping global trade alive.
Yeah, which sounds completely impossible.
Right. Like they're operating the world's most vital supply chains and laying the literal groundwork for the modern English language.
It sounds like a total contradiction
Yeah.
because, we're so conditioned to view history through this lens of, well, static monuments.
Yeah, the big walled cities.
Yeah, exactly. The walls of Rome or the grand palaces of the Han Dynasty. And in that traditional narrative, anyone outside those walls is just a marginal threat, just some mindless barbarian waiting to smash all the beautiful things that civilized people built.
Which brings us to today's deep dive. We are looking at this really comprehensive historical data set from time maps. It's called the Steppe Peoples of Central Asia, Nomads and Warriors. And our mission today, for you listening, is to completely flip your perspective on these Central Asian nomads.
Totally flip it.
Yeah, we're going to show you how they were not just some sideshow, they were actually the central engine of Eurasian history. So, okay, let's unpack this. I want you to think of the steppe nomads not as the barbarians at the gate, but more like the operating system running in the background of the ancient world.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Right. They're this hidden code connecting everything. And sure, occasionally crashing the system entirely.
Right, totally crashing it.
But ultimately driving human progress forward.
Yeah, and to understand how that operating system functioned, you really have to look at the hardware it was built on, which is the geography of Central Asia.
The environment itself.
Exactly. We are talking about the steppes, which is just this unimaginably vast ocean of grasslands. It stretches all the way from modern-day Hungary straight across to Manchuria.
Just an absolutely massive scale.
Huge. And the climate there is brutally unforgiving. I mean, you have searing, just punishing heat in the summers, and then lethal deep freeze winters.
Right.
But more importantly, the soil and the rainfall patterns there, they simply cannot support intensive, dense agriculture.
So you can't just like plant 1,000 acres of wheat and build a city around it.
No, not at all. The environment actively rejects that traditional farming model. It forces a completely different survival strategy.
Which makes sense. If you can't grow crops to feed a ton of people, what do?
Well, you rely on animals that can convert that tough, sparse steppe grass into calories. We're talking sheep, goats, cattle, and crucially horses.
Horses are key here.
Absolutely. But there's a catch. Those herds, they will strip a pasture bare in a matter of days. So you can't stay put. You have to keep moving. The environment literally bred this highly mobile society of horse nomads living in tented encampments. Men, women, children, they basically spent their entire lives in the saddle.
They were perfectly adapted to just perpetual motion.
Yes.
Which, I guess, naturally produces the most lethal cavalry the ancient world had ever seen.
Oh, without a doubt.
Because if you spend your entire life hunting and surviving on horseback, and you can shoot composite bow at full gallop, then, dropping into a farming valley to raid a static settlement is basically effortless.
It's a walk in the park for them.
But, okay, a few guys on horses raiding a village is one thing. How do these scattered, squabbling tents of herders organize themselves into like an existential threat to massive empires like China or Rome?
Right, that is the big question. And the secret lies in their political architecture. It's called the tribal federation.
Okay, break that down for us.
Sure. So at the base level, you had individual tribes, just extended kinship groups that honestly spent most of their time engaged in blood feuds over grazing rights.
Fighting each other.
Constantly. But occasionally, a really charismatic and frankly ruthless leader would emerge, and he would unify these fractured groups into a massive confederation.
And looking at the data, this wasn't like a democracy or an equal partnership, right?
No, not at all.
It was highly stratified. You have what the sources call an inner group and an outer group.
Yeah, and the inner group basically operated like the executive board of a massive corporation.
Okay, I can picture that.
This was the core of the federation. It consisted of the leading clans, and the supreme leader bound these top families to his own through this incredibly complex web of marriage alliances.
So you give your daughters to your top generals, you marry their sisters, that kind of thing.
Exactly. It cemented personal loyalty and created this elite ruling council with just immense status and wealth.
So if the inner group is the executive board, the outer group sounds a lot like the victims of a hostile corporate takeover.
That is a very, very accurate way to frame it. because as the inner group's military power multiplied, the neighboring tribes faced a pretty stark choice.
Submit or die.
Pretty much. Submit voluntarily and join the outer group, or be violently crushed and forcibly absorbed. And these outer tribes, they vastly outnumbered the elite core, but they held a much lower status.
Like cannon fodder.
Yeah, they were often treated as coerced infantry or just semi-free subjects.
Which creates this fascinating but also terrifying logistical nightmare because of the growth imperative of the system.
The snowball effect.
Right. If you absorb a new tribe, you don't just get 10,000 new warriors. You get their families, their sheep, their cattle, and their horses. Suddenly, your federation requires astronomically more grass just to survive.
The snowball is literally forced to keep rolling. You cannot park a federation of that size in one pasture. The animals will literally starve in a week. So to feed the growing herds, you must conquer more territory, which brings you into contact with more tribes, whom you then absorb, which means you need even more grass.
It's an engine of perpetual expansion, fueled entirely by livestock calories.
Precisely.
But wait, if this was an exponentially growing military machine that basically no farming army could withstand in an open field, why didn't a single nomadic federation just, sweep across the globe and maintain a permanent world empire? What was stopping them?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the very mechanism that allowed them to expand so rapidly is exactly what made them fundamentally unstable.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, their political structure was essentially a ticking time bomb, specifically when it came to succession.
Handing over power.
Right. Handing over power from one generation to the next almost always triggered a catastrophic civil war.
Because there's no institutional state, right? There's no constitution to manage the transition. It all relies on the personal strength of one guy.
Exactly. Consider the dilemma of a supreme leader. You have this massive, sprawling outer group of resentful, coerced tribes.
Right.
You can't be everywhere at once to keep them in line, so you have to delegate command. You might put your brothers or your sons in charge of these massive armies.
I can see the flaw there already.
Oh, yeah.
The moment the supreme leader dies, every single brother and son who has an army decides, well, I'm the rightful heir. You've essentially funded and armed your own rivals.
Exactly. You've given them the means to destroy the Federation. Or, alternatively, leaders tried to bypass their ambitious family members by promoting their personal bondsmen.
What's bondman?
Men of low birth who owed their entire careers and their lives solely to the supreme leader.
Which probably enraged the aristocratic inner group.
Oh, absolutely furious.
That's like a CEO ignoring the board of directors and making his personal assistant the vice president of the company.
That's a perfect comparison. The tribal elders would completely refuse to take orders from a servant.
So the resentment would just boil over.
Instantly. So under either strategy, the moment a leader died or showed even a hint of weakness, the Federation would just shatter.
The outer tribes rebel.
The family members turn their armies on each other, and that massive snowball disintegrates back into squabbling factions.
An unstoppable force paralyzed by its own internal family drama.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yet before they fractured, these massive federations inevitably spilled out of the grasslands and crashed head-on into the settled agrarian empires.
Which raises a huge logistical question for me.
Okay, what's that?
If a nomadic army relies entirely on vast oceans of grass to feed its horses, what do they actually do when they conquer a dense farming region? I mean, they can't exactly graze 100,000 horses in a wheat field. Do they just burn the farms down?
Well, in some extreme cases, yes. And that actually leads us to the 4 main strategies nomads use to deal with conquered agricultural zones.
Okay, 4 strategies. The most brutal method, like she said, was literally turning farmland into pasture. They would systematically depopulate the area, dismantle the irrigation systems, and just let the wild grass reclaim the soil.
That is staggering.
Yeah.
It's the equivalent of paving over a lush, highly productive farm just to build a massive parking lot for your horses.
It really is, and it was economically devastating. Elements of the Mongol Empire attempted this in northern China, and it caused catastrophic population loss and economic ruin that literally took centuries to repair.
Man. But I imagine the nomads realized pretty quickly that destroying all that wealth wasn't the smartest long-term play, right?
They did, yeah. The far more common strategy was essentially running a massive extortion racket.
Okay.
The nomads would keep their armies out on the steppe where their horses thrived, and they would demand crippling tribute from the agrarian empires under the threat of punitive raids.
A classic mob shakedown.
Mm-hmm.
Like, nice little civilization you've got here. It'd be a shame if 100,000 horse archers burned it to the ground. That's the Attila the Hun model, isn't it? Like, he didn't actually want to live in a Roman villa. He just wanted the Romans to ship him metric tons of gold to stay away.
Right. It was a highly lucrative business model that required very little administrative effort.
So that's two. What's the third option?
The third option was conquering a mixed zone. So nomadic leaders would target specific geographical areas that featured rich farmland right alongside excellent pasture.
Best of both worlds.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah.
Like the Kushan Empire did in Central Asia. They used the grass to maintain their elite cavalry, and then they used the farms to feed a growing imperial bureaucracy.
And the final option must be assimilation.
Right.
At a certain point, a nomadic leader looks at the comfortable palaces, the hot baths, the stable tax revenue, and just decides to get off the horse.
Assimilation happened all the time. The nomadic elite would abandon the steppe entirely, settle in the cities, and become the new ruling dynasty of the agrarian state. Successive waves of conquerors in China did this, and the Ottomans in the Middle East famously transitioned from Turkic steppe nomads into the bureaucratic rulers of a massive, settled empire.
Now, the farmers didn't just passively accept this dynamic for thousands of years, did they?
No.
They actively tried to solve the nomad problem. The Chinese took an architectural approach, building these massive beaten earth walls to disrupt cavalry movements, which eventually evolved into the Great Wall.
Right.
But looking at the historical data, the Parthians in ancient Iran came up with a completely different, almost biological solution.
Yes, the Parthian strategy is such a brilliant case study in agrarian adaptation.
Tell us about that.
So in the 3rd century BCE, the Parthians controlled northern Iran, which was a region that allowed for extensive mixed farming. And they realized, look, we can't outrun the steppe nomads.
Right, they're too fast.
So they used their agricultural surplus to outmuscle them through selective breeding.
They created a literal arms race, but with horses.
Exactly. You see, the standard steppe pony is incredibly fast and possesses endless stamina, but it's physically pretty small.
Right.
It cannot carry a rider weighed down by heavy metal armor. So the Parthians used their farming infrastructure, specifically the cultivation of nutrient-dense alfalfa, to selectively breed massive war horses.
Because you can't grow a horse that big just on wild steppe grass.
No, not at all.
You need the caloric density of farmed crops to build that kind of bone density and muscle mass.
Precisely. The economics of feeding those animals required a settled agrarian base. And by breeding these massive horses, the Parthians could deploy heavily armored men riding heavily armored beasts.
The cataphracts.
Yes, what we call cataphracts. These were essentially the ancient precursors to medieval knights. They were slow, sure, but they were practically invulnerable to the light arrows of the steppe archers.
Wow.
This biological engineering allowed the Parthians and later the Sasanians to effectively hold the line against the steppe for centuries.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Because we have this image of the steppe nomads as either brutal conquerors paving over farms or mobsters shaking down empires.
Right.
But diving into the actual economics of the era reveals that these supposed mindless barbarians were actually running the most sophisticated supply chain logistics on the planet.
It's amazing.
They were the ultimate facilitators of global trade.
It completely dismantles the traditional narrative of the Silk Road. I mean, we often picture this intrepid Roman merchant or a Chinese trader bravely walking for years across deserts and mountains to exchange goods.
Yeah, just a lone guy with a camel fighting off bandits for thousands of miles.
Right, but that almost never happened. Chinese merchants generally transported their silk to border towns, and Roman or Byzantine merchants stayed comfortably at their Mediterranean ports.
So who did the actual traveling?
The actual grueling transit across thousands of miles of hostile Central Asian terrain was almost exclusively handled by steppe merchants.
Like who?
Groups like the Sogdians and the Uyghurs.
Because they were the only ones who actually understood the environment.
Exactly.
They knew where the oases were, they knew the seasonal weather patterns, and they knew how to negotiate with the tribes.
And those nomadic tribes didn't just blindly raid these merchant caravans. They actively protected them and invested in the infrastructure of trade.
It's like the evolution of the protection racket. I mean, why loot a caravan once and destroy your supply line when you can charge a 5% transit tax on every single caravan that passes through your territory for a century?
Exactly.
They essentially invented the toll road.
They really did. They even built massive structures called caravanseries.
What are those?
These were heavily fortified highway motels spaced a day's journey apart across the steppe. Merchants could pull their camels into the courtyard, sleep safely behind thick walls, water their animals, trade goods.
That's incredible.
And the nomadic confederations provided armed cavalry escorts to ensure these routes were secure from local bandits. Decades later, Marco Polo specifically documented how the Mongol Empire enforced incredibly strict laws to guarantee the safety of merchants traveling through their territory.
The irony is just staggering to me. The very people standard history books dismiss as destructive savages were the ones ensuring that the most vital technological innovations of the ancient world successfully crossed the globe.
Absolutely.
I mean, papermaking, gunpowder, the magnetic compass, silk. These ideas didn't spread despite the nomads. They spread because of them.
Yes.
The nomads were the connective tissue of the global economy.
And because they were that connective tissue controlling this vast high-speed network, any disruption on the steppe echoed across the entire world.
Like a ripple effect.
Bigger than a ripple. A localized turf war over a single grazing valley could trigger a massive chain reaction, a domino effect that literally redrew the geopolitical map of Eurasia.
Okay, let's trace one of those domino effects because it illustrates the mechanics of this perfectly.
Sure.
It starts in the 2nd century BCE, out on the eastern steppes near the Chinese border. And two nomadic federations, the Yuezhi and the Xiongnu, get into a brutal war over territory.
And the Xiongnu emerged victorious, leaving the Yuezhi defeated and basically dispossessed of their homeland.
So the Yuezhi cut their losses and flee westward. But I have to ask, if the Yuezhi are the losers running for their lives, how do they pose a threat to anyone else? Aren't they just a broken army at that point?
You would think so, but a fleeing nomadic federation is still a desperate, highly mobile population of hundreds of thousands of armed riders and their families.
Wow, okay.
They have incredible momentum. So as they fled west to the region east of the Caspian Sea, they crashed violently into another nomadic group living there, the Scythians.
The Scythians get displaced, pushed south into Afghanistan and northwestern India,
Right.
and the Yuezhi just keep rolling, eventually following the Scythians south. They conquer a massive swath of India and establish the Kushan Empire, which is wild on its own. But then the Kushan rulers adopt Buddhism. Why would a bunch of horse nomads adopt an agrarian religion?
Well, because by conquering that territory, the Kushans now controlled a crucial middle sector of the Silk Road. By adopting and patronizing Buddhism, they positioned themselves as the protectors of Buddhist missionaries traveling the trade routes back east toward China.
Oh, that's smart.
It was a highly strategic cultural alignment.
So a fight over grass in Mongolia directly facilitates the spread of Buddhism into China.
Exactly.
And the dominoes keep falling. Generations later, a branch of the Xiongnu, the tribe that won that original fight, begins migrating west.
And archaeological and historical evidence heavily suggests that the descendants of those victorious Xiongnu arrived on the borders of Europe centuries later.
As who?
We know them today as the Huns.
The Huns, who then exert so much pressure on the Germanic tribes and the Roman Empire that they help trigger the collapse of classical antiquity in the West.
It's wild, right?
It is a cosmic game of billiards. A localized dispute in 200 BCE pushes Rome to the brink of collapse and builds a Buddhist empire in India.
It perfectly demonstrates how mobility equals influence. And the data is packed with these systemic impacts. Look further back to the early Indo-European steppe groups in the 4th and 3rd millennia BCE.
Okay, what did they do?
They were the ones who first domesticated the horse and developed the wheeled chariot.
Right. And as they utilized that new mobility to migrate and absorb other populations, they brought their language with them. The mechanics of that linguistic spread are fascinating.
Bill.
The root ancestor of modern English, French, Spanish, Russian, Persian, and Hindi all trace back to the vocabularies of these early writers radiating outward from the Black and Caspian Seas.
They literally rewrote the linguistic operating system of half the globe.
It's unbelievable.
And their political sophistication only grew over time. Consider the Khazars in the 8th century CE. They formed a powerful confederation controlling the crucial western nodes of the Silk Road. Geopolitically, they were sandwiched directly between the rapidly expanding Islamic Caliphate to the south and the Christian Byzantine Empire to the west.
Which is a tough spot to be in, because if the Khazars adopted Islam, they'd become subservient to the Caliph.
Right.
But if they adopted Christianity, they'd fall under the influence of the Byzantine emperor.
Exactly. So they make an absolutely brilliant geopolitical chess move. The ruling elite of the Khazars officially converted to Judaism.
Wow.
It allowed them to maintain their distinct political independence, deal equitably with Jewish merchant networks across the globe, and avoid being absorbed by the massive religious superstates on their borders.
That is brilliant. It demonstrates a level of strategic, macroeconomic thinking that completely defies that mindless raider stereotype.
Completely defies it.
And all of these systemic traits, the rapid mobility, the economic networking, the violent succession crises, they ultimately culminate in the 13th century with Temujin, Genghis Khan.
Right. Genghis Khan was born into the brutal, fractured reality of the steppe, but he possessed an unmatched understanding of its fatal flaws.
He saw the bugs in the system.
Exactly. He realized that the traditional tribal federation, based on kinship and aristocratic inner groups, would always fracture.
Because of the family drama.
Right. So he dismantled it. He deliberately broke the old tribal bloodlines, reorganizing his armies into a strict decimal system.
Like units of 10, 100, 1,000.
Yes, and it was based purely on merit and absolute loyalty to him, not to tribal elders.
He hotwired the operating system. He removed the bugs that caused the succession crashes, at least temporarily, allowing him to weld the steppe into the most terrifyingly efficient military logistics machine the world had ever seen.
And it changed everything.
So what does this all mean? For you listening, when you look at the modern world, the language you are speaking right now, the borders drawn on our maps, the historical foundations of our global supply chains, none of it exists in its current form without the steppe nomads.
That's entirely true.
The modern world wasn't solely forged by men sitting behind stone walls writing laws. It was forged by the network. It was forged by the turf wars in the grass.
The steppe peoples were not the villains lurking at the edge of the map. They were the deep connective tissue of Eurasia.
We really hope this deep dive has shifted your perspective today. We set out to prove that these nomads were the operating system running in the background of ancient history.
And I think we did.
Yeah, when you trace the mechanics of their tribal federations, the economic reality of the Silk Road toll systems, and those staggering domino effects that toppled distant empires, their central role is just undeniable.
Which raises an important question for us to consider today.
Oh, lay it on us.
Well, the steppe nomads dominated and thrived for millennia because they were perfectly adapted to a fast-moving, ever-changing environment. They relied on mobility, ruthless agility, and the control of vast information and trade networks, rather than trying to build static, walled-off monuments.
Right, they survived by being adaptable, not by being heavy.
Precisely. So, looking at our own modern, rapidly shifting, hyper-connected digital landscape,
Yeah.
are we today actually moving away from the static, walled city model of human organization? Are we returning to a nomadic model where agility, mobility, and the ability to seamlessly navigate vast networks are once again the true keys to survival?
Wow, that is a phenomenal thought to end on. If the ancient world's operating system was defined by the speed of a horse and the connections of the steppe, maybe our digital operating system requires that exact same nomadic agility. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking questions, keep challenging the traditional narratives, and keep exploring.